to do. And but only whenever I got to writing this last book did I actually go into the history of where I grew up, and I learned a great deal. I didn't know I was so fortunate, to find out all the history behind the country that I lived in.
Why don't you give me an example about what are the things you discovered?
I grew up right next to the Canadian River. That's in northern Texas, above Amarillo, and it actually begins over by Raton and goes all the way down, and then comes across Texas. And it's a big river. It's an impressive geologic feature in Texas. Well, I grew up right on the riverbanks, and so we used to go picnic into the canyons around there and go. We had a dune buggy whenever I was in high school, and we would zoom around the riverbeds. It was always a very dry river to me, but in fact, it's about a half mile wide worth of river bottom, and it has flooded within the last 2 or 3 decades from one side to the other. So it can be a very impressive river. But it was, in fact, a major thoroughfare for the Indians who were traveling, from the southwest in the New Mexico type territory, going all the way to Oklahoma and Arkansas and upwards. And it was, in fact, crossed by Coronado whenever he came in. He went north to Kansas and had to cross through the Canadian River Valley. Well, what I found out whenever I started researching is that Kit Carson and his company came into the Canadian River, and right within 7 or 8 miles of my house, that was where the biggest battle of the Red River War was in 1874. So I just learned all sorts of stuff. The Battle of the Adobe Walls was right there. So that gave me more of the feeling of what the country had to offer in terms of history. And then it turns out that the major thoroughfare road ran from Fort Smith, Arkansas, all the way to Los Angeles, and it passed within a few miles of my house. It was a wagon road. You're going to go out and see the wagon ruts that still exist in some of the fields.
Amazing. That's an amazing thing to have in your backyard, isn't it? And then to really rediscover it as an adult versus as a child.
Yeah.
What made you interested in writing Westerns in the first place?
Well, actually, this last book is the only Western I've written. And I wasn't actually interested in writing a Western per se. But whenever I started, I found myself in New Mexico needing to get all the way to Oklahoma. So I figured out the only way to go that way would be by wagon. And when you get into that, then I discovered all sorts of things going across the top of Texas. And that really got me into Westerns, even though it was a late era, 1904, as opposed to the 1870s shoot 'em up Westerns. And I was just became fascinated with what the country had to offer.
A lot of your books, especially the Moji Franklin mystery series, are very much based on a mystery, something to solve, and then some moral sort of um, difficulty along the way. Because there's a theft, there's a all those sorts of things that come into it. How did you come to have that idea for that series?
Tony Hillerman. Whenever I was reading Tony Hillerman in the last of the 1990s, then it was fascinating to see the culture that he blended into his mysteries and his detective series with regard to the Navajo people. So that just made me think that that was a really great context into which I could set mysteries. And then I admit that I stole from Clive Cussler the idea of starting my books with a real, more or less, historical event, after which his second chapter then goes on and proceeds to work a real present day mystery that has to rely on discovering what's happening in the past so he could solve what was happening in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So I stole that from him, and between he and Tony Hillerman, then I came up with this idea of creating these mysteries that put it into the geologic, the physical, the landscape, and plus the culture that was involved. Each one of the mysteries that I've written in the Mogi uh, stories, except one, actually occur within a day's drive of Santa Fe. So you can go out there and see the country. I've been in all the places that I wrote about.
Mm-hmm.
And so the description that you see of what's going on in that country and the description of the culture of the people in that country are basically authentic.
Mm-hmm.
And that made it just more fun than anything.
Mm-hmm. How did you get started writing
Um,
fiction?
I was a reader from the beginning. I devoured Party Boy books. I
Mm-hmm.
just loved the mysteries. And then when I got in high school and junior high, I started reading Tolkien. And then in high school, I read some of the classical authors in an English class. My senior year was an English class with a lady that was just wonderful. And we went through 13 or 14 books of the classical type, like Paradise Lost and some of the Hemingway stories. And that got me very interested in being able to communicate using words to communicate what I wanted to talk to people about.
You started out as an independently published author, but you have recently signed with Wolfpack Publishing. How did that relationship come to the fore?
I started out in the 1990s actually wanting to publish books. And I happened to get there at the same time that Amazon made Create Space available to
Mm-hmm.
where you could self-publish. So I started taking my stories and I really wanted to publish my books and have them available in a bookstore so that my mother could buy them
Mm-hmm.
before she died.
Mm-hmm.
And I made it. 2012, she was able to walk into a bookstore and buy 6 of my novels. It was here in town. And then she died within a number of months after that.
Mm-hmm.
So that got me excited about actually having published books. The very first book, see if I can hold this
Mm-hmm. I can
up.
see it, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is all self-published, and that's my photograph from the San Juan River Valley in Utah. And I used Microsoft Word to do all the compositing of it and putting together all the stuff that went into it. Once I had those books printed, I discovered that I really didn't like marketing. So I approached Marty Gerber in
Mm-hmm.
Santa Fe, who
Mm-hmm.
was the head of the Terra Nova Books Company.
Mm-hmm.
And I had by that time 8 books. And I said, do you want to publish these? He said, sure, we'll publish those.
Mm-hmm.
And so he published, and the first book that he did had new covers, and this is the
Mm-hmm.
same one.
That's nice. Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was pretty nice. And so through the years, it took about 5 years to get through all the books. And then by then I had started writing adult books, large format books. So that was working really, really well. And then Scott Gerber died. And so Marty let the company go and they sold it to,
Mango Moon.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talked with them, and it didn't seem like I really belonged with
Mm-hmm.
that company. I wasn't in their vision.
Mm-hmm.
And so in between, I had written this one book, which is a true Western,
Mhm.
which is Death in the Tall Grass. So I wrote that, and this is self-published, and I did it with a lot of help through Reedsea. Reedsea.com is a company that provides you editors, publishers, you name it, they have it. And I enjoyed working with them, and they did all the text preparation, and then I published it through Amazon. So it was a self-published book. Well, it turned out that it won the Spur Award for
Mhm.
historical fiction,
Mhm.
offered by the Western Writers of America.
Mhm. I see that. Mhm.
Well, they had a conference in Tulsa, and I felt like I should show up and get my award.
Mhm.
So on the first day that I was in Tulsa, I was having breakfast, and a gentleman came along and sat down with me and said, "Well, how are you? How are you? You must be here for the writers' conference." And it turned out to be L.J. Martin. L.J. Martin is a prolific Western writer, and he and another fellow had gotten together and created Wolfpack Publishing.
Mhm.
So they were interested in knowing whether I would like to take my self-published book and publish through Wolfpack. And I said, "Oh, not only do I have one, I've
Mhm.
got another 13." He
Mhm.
said, "Well, that would be just fine." So I started working with him, and he got me into Mike Bray, who is the CEO of Wolfpack Publishing. And we struck a deal, and within a couple of months, I had taken all the books from the Santa Fe publisher and moved them into Wolfpack.
Mhm.
Now, I was fortunate in the fact that Wolfpack Publishing, even though it's been around for a decade, they're growing their company, and so they not only had an imprint for Westerns, but they have now a total of 6 imprints, one of which is Christian, one of which is adventure and suspense novels, one is which is dedicated to young adults
Mhm.
and middle grade. And then they just opened up another romance imprint.
Mhm.
And the latest one is they've got now a suspense and a horror imprint. So they're growing their company like crazy.
Mhm.
Well, that fit right in because I had middle grade readers, and
Mhm.
then I had adult readers, and then I had a Western book.
Mhm.
So I'm published with them through 3 different imprints, and it's worked out really well.
Mhm.
You
Absolutely.
have to go to each imprint. I have to go to each imprint and order them if I want my author copies.
Interesting. I mean, that's you really landed very well.
I,
And
I did.
you landed
That's
really well.
called lucky. I was
I was
really lucky.
lucky. Exactly, a bit fortunate. And it's very interesting because the independent publishing community and the books that are being published are sort of being competitive with the traditional publishers right now. In fact, they out publish some in some cases traditional publishers. Um, how do you think your writing will change over the future? What's your next priority?
It's not clear because I like writing about different things. I find something that's interesting,
Mm-hmm.
and then I create a novel around it.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never been one to stay within a genre, um, and I've never been one to not have a lot of fun at it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I will continue to have fun. I continue to be interested in a lot of different things. And for example, I've got a book I'm working on right now that will be published through their Christian publisher. It's a Christian book and it deals with the Shroud of Turin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the happiest clam,
Mm-hmm.
just writing away and seeing what I can do. If I can work at the level of interest that I hope people will be interested in reading what I write.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my, I don't have much of a firm direction of where to go. I'm just trying to stay entertained.